Okay.
However, banks are not required to investigate mere suspicion of fraud. Can you see that? Mere suspicion. Unlike when someone said, look, there is a fraud, and you confirm there is a fraud. Okay, so autonomy, banks deal in documents and not in goods and compliance. So that was the first one, autonomy. So that is the core of our conversation now. Because a number of legal cases revolve around it. Let's go back to the rule. I'll be going back to the rule that relate to that particular principle. A credit by its nature is separate transaction from the sales or other contract which is based. So bank are in no way concerned with or bound by such contract, even if any reference whatsoever is included in the credit. Consequently, the undertaking of a bank to honor, negotiate, or fulfill any obligation under the credit is not subject to claim or defensive by the applicant beneficiary, so the applicant resulting from relationship between the issuing bank or beneficiary. So beneficiary cannot avail itself as the contractual relationship between the bank or between applicant and issuing bank. A bank should discourage any attempt by the applicant to include as an integral part of the credit copy of underlying contract, performance invoice, and the like. Now, the principle of independence states that it operates legally autonomous and separate from the underlying sales and service contract between the buyer and the seller. In other words, the bank obligation to pay is independent of the performance on the underlying contract. So legal basis, as before, again, the credit by its nature is separate transaction from the sales or other contract which is based. Remember yesterday? Can you remember the different contract? Yeah, the different contract. We have the importer bank, we have the confirming bank, we have the exporter bank, and then we have the importer, and then we have the exporter. Between the importer and exporter is an contract, right? Contract number one, between the issuing bank and the customer, that's a contract. Contract number two, if there's a comment bank, that's a contract. Contract number three, if the Citibank and most likely a corresponding bank for this bank, there will be a contract. Contract number four, and if the exporter bank is fund exporter, there will be a contract. Contract number five. And an agreement join everybody together, otherwise called agreement contract number six. And the autonomy says, under no circumstances should a failure of one or two or three or four or five affect payment under six. This means bank deal in document, not in goods, and must honor payment if documents are compliant, even if the goods are defective. Even if the goods are defective. That's why a customer cannot come to the bank and say, you can't pay. Why can't I pay? Because there is a problem. What's the problem? The good is defective. Question. Who received the good? Who received the good? Who received the good you finance? The importer. Who opened the container? Were you there when they opened it? So how you believe what he's saying? How you believe what he's saying? He said it's good, the good is bad. He's the one that said it. When are you happy? Okay. He's the one that said it. When you open the container, you were not there. The issuing bank or confirming bank must pay at once. Pay once the presented document comply with the LC terms, regardless of the dispute between the seller and the buyer. The beneficiary right to pay is protected from interference by applicant except in the case of fraud or forgery. The exception rule is the only recognized limitation. So if documents are fraudulent or presented in bad faith, a court will restrain payment. This is a landmark judgment that is often being quoted around the world that talk about the fraud exception rule between Fenjin, I don't know how to pronounce that, Zizetting, versus J. Henry Stronger, Banking Corporation. If an exporter ship defective goods but present documents that comply perfectly with the LC, the issuing bank must still honor payment. Any dispute over quality to be settled under agreement number one. To be settled under agreement number one. Don't bring the bank into the picture. So the documentary credit, you can't that agree. If an exporter ship defective goods but present documents that comply perfectly with the LC, the issuing bank must still honor payment. Any dispute over quality is settled separately between the buyer and the seller under the agreement number one. Okay. The documentary credit is independent of the line contract. This means that if the extra fulfills the documentary credit obligation of the credit, payment must be effected under the credit regardless of the issue connected to the contract. Therefore, the exporter bit of contract condition, that is the respect of quality, quantity, delivery date, is not sufficient to entitle the importer to instruct his bank to stop payment under the credit. This rule is essential so that parties remain confident that bank will respect their documentary credit payment commitment. The payment obligation of an issuing bank, therefore, is separate and autonomous from underlying contract. The principal exception to this rule is fraud. The bank that receives a clear notification of proof of fraud committed by the beneficiary. So there are some important things when you are trying to use fraud to stop payment. Number one, it must be a material fraud, evident fraud, clear fraud, obvious fraud. Number two, it must be committed not by any other party other than the exporter. So that means exporter that is a payment that committed that fraud. Number three, the bank must be aware of the fraud. The bank must be aware of the fraud. The exporter might inform, the importer might inform them and they always confirm themselves. But they are aware, I think they have information about it. For example, you have received a bill of payment that is obviously defective bill of payment. Or we checked, we were suspended bill of payment, we now checked on that, we now discovered that there was no shipment. So there are a lot of things the bank can easily do to. Yeah, can easily do. But no, the bank will not be liable. The bank are paid before the information goes to the bank will not be liable. Because the bank acted the way it was acted. Yes. Some was that okay. The elements will investigate. But if they have information, okay, I received document. I will not go and check in case. It's different from when I received document and I got to know. Not that I am going to check. They told me. If anything they inform me, then I should check now. Because I'm funding, I'm involved. So I can't claim I'm now aware again. But if there's no information around that, I shouldn't go and be checking in case there is a fraud. The principal exception to this rule has to do with fraud. A bank that receives a clear notification of proof of fraud committed by beneficiary is not only entitled but may be applied under the applicable law without payment. Okay. However, banks are not required to investigate mere suspicion of fraud. Can you see that? Mere suspicion. Unlike when someone said, look, there is a fraud and you confirm there is a fraud. Or when someone just says mere suspicion, I'm suspecting that the customer came and said, I'm suspecting that guy did not ship it. What do you mean by suspecting? What? If you are going to tell me exactly what you think they have done and show me evidence and I can verify what you are saying, rather than just suspecting without anything to substantiate your suspicion. The court are quite reluctant to grant injunction, ordering a bank to withhold payment. Why? So clear indication of fraud are generally necessary, since letter of credit practice to some extent has arisen to avoid risk related to lack of knowledge and trust between the two trading parties. It is essential, therefore, that both parties trust the bank, and that's why the bank needs to be very careful. Letter of credit will not function if the party lack confidence that the bank will honor their obligation regardless of the arguments submitted by the party. Judges are referred to the letter of credit as lifeblood financial trade. So, if the bank were allowed to refuse to pay letter of credit whenever trading parties had a dispute, the vital flow of financial commerce will soon be blocked and will be in big trouble because of how much transaction. Even though it's about 10% of 24 trillion. 10% of 24 trillion is 2.4 trillion. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of transactions. It's about 9%. I just use 9% as an example. In some cases, issuing bank officers may be obliged to resist pressure from applicants to bend the principle of absolute neutrality and independence whenever the buyer applicant has a suspicion that the goods are non-conforming. The buyer may wish to stop payment under the letter of credit. Unfortunately, however, it's quite possible for a seller to send back merchandise so long as this does not amount to clear fraud and yet present good documents. That is one of the reasons for pre-shipment or post-shipment inspection. So, certificate, and this is frequently called for in trade transactions. If the importer learns that it may receive an inadequate or late shipment, it may sue for damages because they have a contract. But this action will be outside the letter of credit and outside of PCT. So, independent. Independent, independent, independent. Number two, strict compliance. Compliant presentation according to the rule says a presentation in accordance again with the rule. Compliance in LC has to do with LC terms, checking against UCP, and checking against international standard banking practice. Article 14 says a nominated bank acting on its nomination, a confirming bank, if any, and issuing bank must examine a presentation to determine on the basis of document alone whether or not the document appear on their face to constitute a compliant presentation. Data in the document wherein in context with the credit, the document itself and international standard banking practice need not be identical to but must not conflict with data in that document and any other stipulated document. In document other than the commercial invoice, description of goods can be in general terms. But if it is in general terms, we must not complete description in the credit.